A mother arrives home earlier than usual and discovers her twin children naked in bed. However, it's the unsettling truth behind the scene that will shake her to the core and leave everyone in disbelief. Ava had always been intimately familiar with the weight of her responsibilities. As a mother, a wife, and a dedicated professional, her days blurred together in an exhausting rhythm, rarely offering her a moment to breathe. But tonight, something felt off, a subtle unease creeping beneath the surface. She arrived home later than usual, fatigue settling heavily into her bones as she pushed open the front door. The house greeted her with an unsettling quiet, a stark contrast to the usual bustling energy of her evenings. Her sister Chloe, who had long been the reliable nanny, stood waiting in the hallway. Her face was pale, her hands nervously twisting together. "Ava, there's something I need to tell you," Chloe began, her voice wavering with an anxious tremor, as though the weight of her words might fracture the fragile peace that still hung in the air. Ava dropped her purse by the door, frowning as she slipped off her shoes. The simple act, which usually brought a sense of release from the pressures of the day, offered no comfort tonight. "What happened?" she asked, though a sinking feeling had already settled in her chest, bracing her for the worst. Chloe hesitated, glancing behind her as if to ensure no one else could hear. She spoke in barely a whisper. "I was downstairs, making lunch, and I heard noises coming from Zoe's room. When I went up to check, I found—" Chloe's voice faltered, trembling as she continued, "Zoe wasn't wearing anything, Ava. And Logan, he was there too. He ran out the second I opened the door." Ava's heart pounded in her ears, her mind reeling as she tried to comprehend the words. The ground beneath her seemed to shift, leaving her unsteady. "Are you certain, Chloe? You're sure about what you saw?" she asked, her voice edged with disbelief. Chloe's expression hardened, frustration flickering in her eyes. "Ava, I wouldn't make this up. You know that." A cold dread settled over Ava, spreading through her limbs like ice. Chloe had always been trustworthy, but the image she described, her own children, innocent and only 12, involved in something so disturbing, felt impossible. For a moment, Ava simply stood there, staring at her sister, trying to make sense of it all. Logan and Zoe were twins. Curious, of course, but this? No, it couldn't be true. They were still just children. She found them in the living room, curled up together on the couch, their faces lighting up as soon as they saw her. "Mommy!" Zoe exclaimed, leaping up to hug her, with Logan close behind. They wrapped their small arms around her, and for a fleeting moment Ava felt the warmth of their love, a comfort so strong it almost erased Chloe's words from her mind. But reality weighed heavy on her shoulders. Gently she pulled away, her voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." The children looked up at her, their eyes wide with curiosity and innocence. "What is it?" Logan asked, his voice quiet. "Your Aunt Chloe told me something happened in Zoe's room today. She said you were both there, and—" Ava's throat tightened as she tried to find the right words. "She said you weren't wearing any clothes." A thick silence fell over the room. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. After what felt like an eternity, Logan shook his head. "That's not true, Mommy. We didn't do anything." His voice was steady, his face sincere. Zoe nodded, echoing him. "Aunt Chloe is lying," she insisted, her conviction unwavering. Ava's gaze shifted between the two of them. Their voices held no hesitation, no hint of guilt. They spoke with such certainty that for a brief moment Ava wondered if Chloe could have misunderstood. "Are you sure?" Her voice cracked slightly, tinged with desperation. "You know I won't accept lies." "Yes, Mommy," Logan replied, his voice as calm as ever. Zoe stood by his side, her small fists clenched. "We're telling the truth." Ava stared at her children, her heart torn. They seemed so sure, so innocent. But Chloe wouldn't lie. She had no reason to. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Ava lay awake, her mind racing. She hadn't told her husband Ethan yet. How would he react? What would he say? The uncertainty gnawed at her, keeping sleep at bay. Something was wrong in her home. She could feel it deep in her gut, in the way her children looked at her with those wide, untroubled eyes. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. And yet, despite everything, Ava was determined to uncover the truth. As the days passed, life continued as though nothing unusual had occurred. Strangely, Chloe hadn't brought up the incident with the twins again. Maybe Chloe had overreacted or misunderstood, Ava reasoned. Zoe and Logan had always been inseparable, their bond as close as twins could be. It wasn't out of the ordinary for them to spend all their time together. She tried to brush away the lingering unease that had taken root since that night. Ava wanted to trust in her children's innocence, in the love and care Chloe had always shown them. But life, she knew too well, often threw unexpected challenges in the path of even the most ordinary days. One afternoon, while tidying up Logan's room, the unsettling feeling crept back. She was wiping dust off his desk, picking up toys scattered across the floor, when her eyes drifted toward his dresser. An odd sensation tugged at her, an intuition she couldn't ignore. Hesitant, she slowly opened one of the drawers and began organizing his clothes. Then, something caught her eye. A small piece of fabric. Not just any fabric. It was a pair of Zoe's underwear, carefully folded among Logan's shirts. For a moment, the air felt thick, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. Her breath hitched as she stared at the fabric, her mind racing to piece together half-formed thoughts and quiet suspicions that had lingered for days. How had this ended up here? "Logan!" Her voice, sharp and panicked, echoed through the house. "Logan!" She called again, louder, her voice bordering on hysteria as it bounced off the quiet walls. The silence of the home seemed to magnify her dread. Moments later, Logan appeared in the doorway, his face pale with worry. "Mom? What's wrong?" he asked, his eyes darting nervously between her and the dresser. Ava held up the underwear, her hand trembling. "What is this, Logan? Explain this to me," she demanded, disbelief thick in her voice. Logan's eyes widened in confusion, his expression a mix of fear and bewilderment. I don't know, Mom. I don't know how that got there," he stammered, clearly shaken. Ava's gaze bore into him, her voice rising with a mix of anger and confusion. "You expect me to believe that? This is your sister's. How did it end up in your drawer?" Logan's voice cracked as he pleaded. "I don't know. Maybe Aunt Chloe put it there by accident when she was folding the laundry. I swear, I didn't do anything." Ava's heart raced as she studied her son's face, searching desperately for any trace of a lie. His eyes were wide with fear, his small body trembling under her intense scrutiny. After a long moment, she let out a shaky breath and gently placed the underwear back in the drawer. "Go," she whispered, not meeting his eyes as he hurried out of the room. Once he was gone, Ava collapsed onto his bed, her thoughts spinning in a chaotic whirl. "God," she muttered to herself, staring up at the ceiling. "What is happening to my family?" The afternoon dissolved into evening, and as the shadows grew long outside, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was looming over her home. The silence inside the house felt suffocating, pressing down on her from all sides as though the very walls were waiting for something, anything, to break the tension. Later that night, when Ethan returned from work, Ava wasted no time in telling him everything. She recounted the discovery of the underwear, Logan's reaction, and the growing unease that had taken hold of her. Ethan listened carefully, his brow furrowing in concern as she spoke. When she finished, he shook his head, frustration tinged with disbelief. "That's ridiculous, Ava," he said, his voice firm. "They're just kids. You're overthinking this." Ava's eyes filled with doubt as she replied softly, "I want to believe that, but it doesn't make sense. Something feels wrong." Ethan sighed, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. "They said they didn't do anything, right? Maybe Chloe did make a mistake. Maybe you're letting your imagination get the best of you," he suggested. Though even as he spoke, Ava noticed a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Neither of them had answers, and as the silence between them deepened, so did the growing sense of unease that had already begun to create a divide in their family. That night, as the house fell back into its quiet, oppressive stillness, Ava's mind raced. She couldn't sleep. The questions gnawed at her, and the tension clung to her like a shadow that refused to let go. Days passed, and though she tried to push her fears aside, they remained ever present, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when everything would finally unravel. Life in the house continued as if nothing unusual had occurred, but Ava couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clung to her. Chloe hadn't mentioned the incident again, and the silence only deepened Ava's uncertainty. She kept telling herself that maybe Chloe had overreacted or misunderstood the situation. One afternoon, when Chloe asked for the day off, Ava decided to come home early. As she stepped inside, the house greeted her with an eerie stillness, a quiet so intense it felt suffocating. She dropped her bag at the door, calling out, "Zoe! Logan!" But there was no response. Her heartbeat quickened, the silence unsettling her. She moved through the living room, glancing around, but the kids were nowhere to be found. The kitchen stood empty, the backyard untouched. The quiet gnawed at her, making her swallow nervously. They must be upstairs, she thought, and began climbing the stairs. With each step, Ava felt a growing sense of unease. She reached the top of the stairs, and that's when she noticed Zoe's bedroom door slightly ajar. Ava paused, her heart pounding harder in her chest, an inexplicable tension gripping her. She quietly approached and nudged the door open. Inside, she saw Zoe and Logan sitting on the bed, but something about their posture and the atmosphere in the room felt off. The kids jumped, startled by her sudden presence. Their wide eyes, full of surprise, only deepened her concern. "What are you two doing in here?" Ava asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though the unease was clear. The children fidgeted, clearly nervous, and Ava felt a knot tighten in her chest. She didn't have all the answers, but something felt wrong, and she knew she had to address it. The tension in the room was palpable, and as Ava looked at her children, her thoughts swirled with confusion and worry. "We didn't do anything, Mummy." Logan's voice trembled as he frantically tried to cover himself, desperation etched across his face. "We didn't do anything wrong." Ava's hands shook as she edged closer, her eyes wide, trying to process the scene before her. "Don't lie to me!" she spat, her voice sharp and unfamiliar to her own ears. "Tell me the truth." "We're not lying," Zoe sobbed, curling into herself on the bed, pulling her knees to her chest as tears streamed down her cheeks. "We didn't do anything bad." Their cries filled the room, raw and filled with fear, and for the first time, Ava's anger faltered. She looked at them, her children, her babies, terrified and trembling, and doubt crept in. Could they truly not understand? Could they be telling the truth? Ava couldn't stand the confusion any longer. She spun around and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Her breath came in short, uneven bursts as she paced up and down the hallway, her thoughts spiraling. Later that evening, once the children were tucked into bed, she decided to tell Ethan. She hadn't wanted to. Part of her had considered keeping it to herself. But this was too big, too disturbing to carry alone. He had to know. As she spoke, Ethan listened in grim silence, his brow furrowing deeper with every word, his hands clenched tightly into fists. When she finished, he stood abruptly, unable to sit still, and began pacing the room. "I can't believe this," he muttered, shaking his head. "Our kids doing that? No. This has to stop, Ava. I'm going to talk to them. This kind of behavior, it's just not right." Ava let out a long, tired sigh, pressing her hands to her temples. "I don't know what to do, Ethan. They keep saying they didn't do anything wrong, but how can we be sure?" His frustration was palpable, the tension in the room almost suffocating. "We'll figure this out, Ava. We have to. They need to understand this is wrong. We can't just let it go." That night, when Ethan confronted the twins, their story remained unchanged. Through their tears, they continued to insist that nothing inappropriate had happened. The more they insisted, the more confused and unsettled Ava and Ethan became. The days stretched on, each one weighed down by the growing tension in their home. Ava felt suffocated by the uncertainty, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the situation. The children's unwavering claims of innocence left her feeling paranoid, as though something darker was happening beneath the surface, something she couldn't yet grasp. And then one night, as she lay next to Ethan in the darkness, staring up at the ceiling, an idea took shape. Hidden cameras. If there was something going on, something the children weren't admitting to, she'd capture it. It was the only way to truly uncover the truth. In a quiet, determined moment, Ava decided, she would install hidden cameras throughout the house. It was the only way she'd ever get to the bottom of this nightmare. With a sigh of contentment, Ava thought to herself, "That's settled." She made a deliberate choice to keep her plan to herself, telling no one, not her children, her husband Ethan, nor her sister Chloe, who worked as their nanny. She needed to see for herself what had been gnawing at her instincts. The day had dragged on at work, yet the unease tugging at her wouldn't let go. It pushed her to leave her office early and head home without notice. As she carefully opened the front door, an unusual stillness met her. The usual sounds of life, the bustle of home, were conspicuously absent. The quiet was thick and unsettling, amplifying the tension in the air. Ava slipped off her shoes, her movements quiet and deliberate, and began making her way upstairs. Then she heard it, a faint rustle, a whisper of movement from behind one of the doors. Her pulse quickened. As she reached the top of the stairs, the bedroom door opened slightly, and there he was, Ethan, stepping out. His shirt was half-buttoned, his hair tousled as though he'd hurriedly fixed it. The moment he saw her, he froze. "Ava," he stammered, his voice wavering with surprise. "What are you doing here?" Her eyes locked on him, scanning the details of his appearance. The wrinkled pants, the belt hanging loosely from his waist, and the shirt haphazardly tucked in. Instinct told her something was terribly wrong. The pieces fell into place in her mind with sickening clarity. "Ethan?" she asked sharply, her voice slicing through the thick silence. "What exactly are you doing here?" He shifted awkwardly, running a hand through his hair, his unease palpable. I came home early too. Wanted to check on the kids," he said, forcing a casual tone. "With Chloe off today, I just wanted to make sure they weren't up to anything." Ava's brow furrowed, confusion clouding her thoughts. His explanation seemed too convenient, too rehearsed. Before she could respond, Ethan quickly moved past her, reaching for her hand. "Come on," he urged, his voice trying to sound light. "Let's check on them together. Maybe they're up to something fun." They headed toward Logan's room first. Ethan knocked softly before pushing the door open. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn, and Logan lay sprawled across his bed, absorbed in a video game. "Hey, buddy," Ethan called, stepping into the room. "What are you up to?" Without even glancing up, Logan gave a nonchalant shrug. "Just playing," he muttered, his eyes glued to the screen. Ava lingered at the door, watching the scene unfold, her mind still spinning with unanswered questions. Why was Ethan so focused on the kids? Why did he look so disheveled? Was this all an elaborate distraction? Her thoughts spiraled until Ethan turned to her with a smile that felt too forced. "Looks like Logan's behaving himself," he remarked. "Let's go check on Zoe." He didn't wait for a reply, guiding her out of the room and down the hallway to Zoe's door. It was slightly ajar, and Ethan gently pushed it open. Inside, Zoe sat on her bed, curled up with a book in her lap, utterly unaware of the tension simmering between her parents. "Hi, sweetie," Ava said softly, her voice betraying the storm of emotions brewing beneath the surface. Zoe looked up, flashing a small smile. "Hey, Mom, just reading." Ethan chuckled, leaning against the doorframe. "Well, looks like everyone's being good today," he said with a hint of relief, turning back toward Ava. "Maybe I was worried for nothing." Ava tried to return his smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe," she muttered. Ethan took her hand again, steering her away from the upstairs rooms. "Why don't we head back downstairs? No need to worry about the kids today," he said, his voice casual as he began talking about his day, offering to make dinner as they reached the kitchen. But for Ava, the silence around her had thickened into something oppressive. It wrapped around her like a heavy fog, clinging to her thoughts as she sat in front of the computer, watching the camera footage she had set up days ago. Hours and hours of monotonous recordings blurred together, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that screamed for attention. And yet, the weight of unease hadn't lifted. The faint hum of the monitor and the steady ticking of the clock filled the empty room as Ava's eyes scanned the flickering images. Something was wrong. She knew it. But what exactly, she couldn't yet see. Ava had painstakingly reviewed each video file, hoping for any clue, some sign to confirm what she feared. Yet tonight felt different. As her finger hovered over the mouse, she hesitated, her breath catching. The screen flickered, and slowly, blurry shapes emerged from the static. At first, the images made little sense, but then, with startling sharpness, they came into focus. Ava's stomach lurched, and a cold chill washed over her. Her breath hitched in her throat as she clung to the edge of the desk, her body trembling uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face. She stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, numb to everything around her. She had seen enough. The truth was undeniable, but the weight of it left her paralyzed, unable to move or think clearly. Tomorrow, she would confront them. Tomorrow, they would face the consequences of what they had done. The night dragged on, each minute creeping by, heavy and relentless. Sleep was impossible. Ava remained seated on the couch, her eyes fixed on the now black computer screen, her mind trapped in a whirlwind of shock, anger, and heartbreak. Dawn began to filter through the curtains, casting a pale light across the room, but it did nothing to ease the burden pressing down on her chest. Her hands, tightly clasped in her lap, trembled. Her face was ghostly pale, her eyes hollow. She hadn't moved since the night before, lost in an endless loop of disbelief and pain. It wasn't until Chloe arrived later that morning that the silence was broken. At first, Ava didn't acknowledge her sister's presence. She didn't even flinch when Chloe's voice called out, filled with concern. "Ava, what's going on?" Chloe asked gently, stepping closer, worry evident in her tone. Ava's gaze remained fixed on the floor, her body unnaturally still. Chloe cautiously reached out, hovering her hand over Ava's shoulder before resting it lightly. "Ava, please," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You're scaring me. What's wrong?" Without warning, Ava jerked upright, a bitter, hollow laugh escaping her lips. The sound was cold and unnerving, causing Chloe to step back, startled. "Chloe!" Ava hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "Don't touch me!" At that moment, Ethan entered the room, a look of confusion crossing his face as he glanced between the two sisters. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice tinged with frustration. He looked to Chloe, then back to Ava, now standing, her fists clenched at her sides. "Ava, tell me what's wrong," Ethan said, impatience growing in his tone. "This is absurd." Ava's eyes darkened, her fury barely contained as she turned to face him. Her voice was low, steady, and dangerous. "You want to know what's wrong?" she spat, stepping toward him, her anger palpable. "I'll show you." Without another word, she grabbed Ethan's wrist, then Chloe's, dragging them both toward the computer at the corner of the room. Her movements were forceful, her grip like steel. "What are you doing?" Ethan muttered, irritation creeping into his voice as he glanced nervously at Chloe, whose face had gone pale. Ava didn't respond. She slammed the mouse onto the desk and, with cold precision, clicked through the files. The video she'd seen the night before flickered onto the screen. The room fell deathly silent as the truth unfolded before their eyes. The footage showed Ethan entering the guest bedroom. It was from a day when both he and Chloe had come home early. Moments later, Chloe appeared in the frame, stepping into the room behind him. As the video played, their bodies moved closer, entwining in ways that made Ava's stomach churn with disgust. She gripped the desk tighter, her knuckles white as she forced herself to watch. In the corner of the screen, another camera captured movement in the hallway. Ava squinted at the small figures, and her heart clenched. It was Zoe and Logan, her children. They stood frozen at the door, peeking through a crack, their innocent faces watching the scene unfold inside the room. Ava's breath hitched again, her mind spiraling as she realized the depth of the betrayal. Her children, wide-eyed with curiosity, had no idea what they were witnessing. They didn't understand. She could see it in the way their small hands gripped the doorframe, their expressions a mix of confusion and innocence. The room remained silent as the video played on, the weight of it pressing down on all of them like a suffocating fog. But then, in the corner of the screen, Ethan's gaze flickered. The camera captured the moment his eyes darted toward the hallway, toward Zoe and Logan standing at the door. His face paled as he realized they were watching. What happened next shattered what little remained of Ava's heart. Zoe and Logan, unaware of the significance of what they had witnessed, innocently mimicked the scene they had seen earlier. They removed their clothes, lying down together, with Zoe even imitating the strange noises she had heard coming from Chloe. The realization hit hard, and the color drained from his face as he understood what the children had stumbled upon and unknowingly reenacted in their bedroom. For a moment, silence filled the room. The only noise was the faint hum of the computer screen where the video played on, casting an eerie glow over them. Slowly, Ava turned to face her family. There were no more words left to say. The truth hung heavy in the air. Ethan and Chloe stood frozen in place, staring at the screen, their faces pale and eyes wide with shock. The ticking of the clock on the wall was the only reminder that time still moved, though inside the house it felt as if the world had come to a standstill. Ava's hand twitched at her side, her fingers curling into a fist as fury began to boil inside her. Her heart raced, pumping hot with anger, betrayal, and disgust. She had seen enough, more than enough. In a single swift movement, Ava stormed forward and slapped Chloe hard across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the room like a gunshot, and Chloe staggered back, tears welling up in her eyes immediately. "How could you?" Ava's voice trembled, thick with emotion, her eyes blazing with unshed tears. "I gave you everything. A job, a place to stay, money when you needed it. And this is how you repay me, by sleeping with my husband, your own sister." Chloe clutched her cheek, her lip quivering as tears spilled down her face. "Ava, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she stammered, her voice barely holding together. "Please, you have to believe me." "Believe you?" Ava spat the words with venom, stepping closer. Her voice rose with each word, her anger swelling like a storm. "You want me to believe you? After you've ruined my family, my marriage, my children's lives?" Ethan, who had been standing in stunned silence, finally stepped forward, his hands raised as if to calm her. "Ava, please calm down," he pleaded, his voice low and measured. "It was a mistake, all right? We never meant for this to happen. I know it was wrong, but let's not make this worse than it already is." "Make it worse?" Ava whipped around to face him, her eyes narrowing in a fury that burned even hotter. "You think it could get worse, Ethan? You, my husband, the father of my children, betrayed me with my own sister. You made it worse!" Without warning, she slapped him too, even harder than she had hit Chloe. The force of it sent Ethan stumbling back, his hand flying to his cheek, shock written all over his face. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice shaking with rage. "How dare you try to downplay this with some weak apology? I gave everything to this family. I worked tirelessly. I gave you children. I sacrificed my dreams for you, and this is how you repay me? By sleeping with Chloe behind my back?" Ethan's expression twisted, but he stayed silent. He knew there were no words that could fix this, no excuse that could undo the damage. The weight of what they had done hung heavy in the air between them, impossible to ignore. Ava's anger was a living, breathing thing now, rising from the deep well of pain and betrayal that consumed her. "Get out," she said, her voice cold and resolute. "Both of you, now." Chloe broke into sobs, stepping toward Ava with trembling hands. "Please, Ava, I'm begging you. I never wanted to hurt you. You have to understand." "Understand?" Ava's words were icy, each one sharper than the last. "There's nothing to understand, Chloe. You betrayed me in the worst way possible, and there's no coming back from that." Chloe collapsed to her knees, crying uncontrollably, her hands clasped together as if begging for mercy. But Ava's heart had turned to stone. There was no forgiveness left to give. "Get out of my house," Ava said again, her voice low, each word a final blow. "Both of you." Ethan, realizing there was no use in arguing, moved to help Chloe to her feet. But as soon as his hand touched her, Ava's voice rang out, sharp and fierce. "Don't touch her," she snapped. You don't get to play the hero now. Pack your things and leave." There were no more words exchanged, no more pleas. Ava stood her ground, watching as they hurried to gather their belongings, the weight of their betrayal pressing down on them like an unbearable burden. The door slammed behind them, the sound final and deafening. In the heavy silence that followed, the full weight of what had happened crashed over Ava, leaving her breathless, alone, and broken. As the night deepened, casting long shadows across the quiet house, Ava sat down with her children. Logan's and Zoe, normally so full of life, were subdued, their confusion palpable. They felt the tension, but didn't fully grasp its meaning. Ava's heart ached for them, knowing their innocence had been caught in the storm of the adults' mistakes. "I need to talk to you both about what happened," she began, her voice gentle but firm. Their wide, worried eyes locked onto hers, a mixture of curiosity and fear swirling within them. "What you saw between your father and your aunt, it wasn't right. It was something that never should have happened," Ava explained, her words deliberate, trying to shield them from the harshest truths without denying their reality. "I want you to understand that it's not something you should ever think is okay or copy." Logan's nodded slowly, his hand gripping Zoe's tightly. "But Mom," Zoe whispered, her voice trembling, "are we in trouble?" Ava's heart cracked a little more. "No, sweetheart," she reassured them, her tone softening. "You're not in trouble. None of this is your fault. Sometimes adults make bad choices. Just because they're older doesn't mean they always do the right thing." She looked at both of them, her gaze serious but full of love. "Your father and Chloe made a big mistake, but that doesn't mean you should think it's something acceptable. You're good kids. Don't ever let anyone make you believe otherwise." Silence hung in the air again, but this time it was different. A silence filled with understanding, a moment where innocence was guarded instead of lost. In the days that followed, Ava made the hardest decision of her life. Divorce was inevitable now. There was no mending what had been shattered. Ethan was removed from her life, and Chloe, despite tearful pleas for forgiveness, would never be welcome in Ava's home again. Even when their mother called, urging Ava to forgive and to let Chloe back into the family fold, Ava remained resolute. "I've forgiven her, but that doesn't mean I'll let her back in my life," Ava replied firmly, her voice steady. "I don't need people who tear down what I've spent my life building." Her mother fell silent, sensing the finality in her words. As the weeks rolled on, Ava found herself alone, but unwavering in her decision. She had lost a marriage, her faith in her sister, and the life she had spent years nurturing, but what she gained was clarity. In letting go of those who had broken her, she began to heal. The days came slowly at first, marked by the kind of quiet that follows a storm. But it wasn't the oppressive silence of betrayal. This quiet was peaceful, a calm that settled in the bones, a stillness she hadn't felt in years. Weeks had passed since Ethan left. She hadn't heard from him, nor did she care to. He had become a distant figure, someone who no longer haunted her thoughts. But one afternoon, as she waited outside the school to pick up Logan's and Zoe, she saw him. Across the street, half hidden behind a tree, stood Ethan. He looked familiar, yet different. Older, worn down by his choices. His eyes were fixed on their children as they ran toward her, backpacks bouncing with each step. But when he noticed her looking back at him, his gaze quickly dropped, and in seconds, he vanished into the crowd. Ava's heart remained steady, unbothered by his presence. She turned back to her children, pulling them into a warm embrace, as if nothing had happened. Ethan was a part of the past now, and she had no desire to linger there. Not long after, her mother called again with hesitant news. "Chloe and Ethan, they've broken up." Her voice careful, unsure of how Ava would react. But Ava didn't flinch. "I don't care, Mom," she said, cutting off the conversation with calm finality. "Please don't mention them to me again." The silence on the other end of the line said everything. It wasn't anger that drove Ava's words, but a quiet acceptance, a clean break from what no longer mattered. For the first time in what felt like years, she felt light, free. Her focus now was on her children. Logan's and Zoe had grown even closer to her after everything. They were resilient, strong, but Ava noticed the subtle ways they had changed, changes only a mother could see. Zoe had grown more thoughtful, more attuned to the emotions swirling around her. Logan's, once carefree, had become a quiet protector, watching over his sister with a gentle but ever-present vigilance. In the end, they had all weathered the storm, and while the life Ava had known was gone, what she found in its place was something more valuable: peace and the strength to move forward. Together, the three of them had slowly rebuilt their lives from the ground up. Ava made sure their home brimmed with laughter again. They rediscovered joy in the little things, cooking together at family dinners, spending lazy weekends at the park, and losing themselves in late-night movie marathons. The heavy shadow of the past had finally lifted, replaced by something far more valuable: a sense of unity, of peace. In the quiet moments, Ava found herself reflecting on how much they had overcome. She had crafted a life she was proud of, not just for herself, but for her children. And as she watched them grow more resilient, she realized her own strength had always been there, lying dormant, waiting to rise from the ashes of her broken marriage. But Ava didn't stop there. With the weight of her ex-husband Ethan and the betrayal of her sister Chloe now behind her, she embraced her newfound freedom. For years, she had been lost in the roles of wife and mother, forgetting who she truly was. Now, with the space to breathe and the time to dream, she began rediscovering the parts of herself she had long neglected. She joined a local book club, something she had always longed to do but never made time for. Through it, she met new people and formed new friendships, bringing warmth and laughter back into her life. She also picked up painting again, an old passion she had set aside in the whirlwind of marriage and motherhood. With each brushstroke, she felt fragments of herself returning, piecing together the woman she once was. For the first time in years, Ava allowed herself to dream. She dreamed of traveling, of packing up the car and taking her kids on a cross-country road trip, stopping in small towns and watching sunsets over wide-open skies. She dreamed of learning new things, perhaps taking up photography, or finally learning to play the piano, a hobby she had once imagined but never pursued. The future stretched before her like an endless highway, full of promise and new beginnings. Of course, there were still difficult days. Sometimes, the memories would resurface. Old wounds would ache, and the sting of betrayal felt as fresh as ever. But those moments were fleeting now, and with each passing wave, Ava stood a little stronger, a little more sure of the new life she was creating. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast a warm, golden glow across the yard, Ava sat on the porch, watching Zoe and Logan play. Their laughter rang through the air, a melody that filled her heart with contentment. She smiled softly, sipping her tea as she watched them run through the grass, their joy infectious. This, she thought, is what peace feels like. As the sky darkened and stars blinked into view, Ava looked out toward the horizon. For the first time in a long while, she felt no fear, about the future. Only hope. Hope and a quiet, unshakable confidence. She had weathered the storm, and now she stood on the other side, stronger and more certain of herself than ever. Life, Ava realized, wasn't just about surviving the hard times. It was about reclaiming your dreams, about finding joy again, about thriving in ways she hadn't thought possible. She took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling her lungs, and smiled. The road ahead was bright, lined with possibilities she never dared to imagine. This time, she was walking it on her own terms. And with her children by her side, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. As their laughter echoed into the night, Ava knew one thing with absolute certainty. The future was hers, and it was radiant. Wow, what a story, right? I can't even begin to express the shock and betrayal that we all felt watching this unfold. This story isn't based on real events, but it touches on something very real. Kids are always watching and learning from us, even when we don't realize it. They pick up on everything, from the way we talk to how we behave, and sometimes they imitate things they don't fully understand. The consequences of that can be harmful, as we saw in this story. As parents, it's so important for us to stay alert to the little things our children are doing, saying, or even witnessing. Whether they're boys or girls, our job is to protect them, guide them, and be aware of their world, because sometimes they can pick up behaviors that we never intended to teach them. What do you think? Have you noticed moments where your kids imitate something they saw from you or someone else? Let's talk about it in the comments. Share your thoughts or your own experiences. And if you found this story thought-provoking, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so we can keep these important conversations going. Stay safe, and always remember to protect the ones you love.